In today's interconnected world, the products we use daily often have complex journeys before they reach us. Ever wondered how a laptop or smartphone designed in one country but assembled in another impacts the economy? Welcome to The Economy. How do you measure that? Where we explore the fascinating world of macroeconomic statistics and how we measure what's really happening in the economy, one transaction at a time. Today's episode is on factoryless goods production. So imagine a company that designs a laptop in one country, but doesn't actually manufacture them. Instead, the laptops are made by a factory overseas. So here's the question. Who gets to count that production in their GDP? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Jennifer Ribarsky from the IMF Statistics Department and an expert in global value chains and factoryless goods production. So Jennifer, let's start with the basic question. What is factoryless goods production? How do you produce a good without a factory?
Well, factoryless goods production refers to the phenomenon where the company designs and provides the intellectual property into a product, but outsources the transformation of that product into a final good, often to a third party and often overseas.
Okay, so we have a firm in the US who's designing something, and we have a firm in Asia who's building something. So who gets to count this in their GDP? The US, Asia, how does this work?
Well, the first thing I'd like to emphasize is that GDP is a value-added concept. So what's recorded in the US is that part of the production value that the U.S. added value to.
Okay, so this is getting a little bit complicated. So you're saying a firm that manufactures a laptop may not actually manufacture the laptop, that firm is sitting somewhere without a factory, but that laptop is getting credited to them. So can you explain this with a bit of an example?
Yeah, sure, Jim. It's a little complicated because it does depend on who owns the inputs and who takes the production risk. So let me give you an example. So if the U.S. company designs the laptop, has the branding on the laptop, owns the raw materials, sends it overseas, and has this third-party contractor assemble it, most of the value added is recorded in U.S. GDP.
Okay, so the U.S. firm owns the inputs. Either they have them in a warehouse where they are, or they own them because they bought them in another country and they just send them to the factory. So most of that good will be recorded in the U.S. GDP. Now, what about if they don't own those inputs? What if the only thing they own is the design? How does that work? How does that all fit together in GDP and international trade?
So it's a little bit of a different recording. So in the first example, when the company was being imported back into the U.S., that good, it actually, when the company owns the raw materials, it's recorded actually as an import of a service. Even though you're getting a physical object, that is really just a manufacturing service. But when the contract manufacturer abroad owns the raw materials, they provide the labor input, they act more like a traditional manufacturer, but that additional value of that intellectual property embedded in that product is not counted. Now, the tricky part is that import back into the U.S. is actually recorded as a good and not a service.
Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit just so I have all of this straight, because it does get a little bit complicated. So if the U.S. firm owns the goods and has somebody in, say, Asia assemble the laptop, what they're really importing is a service. So they're just importing a service. It's an assembly service that they're importing. And that's probably not a very large import because the bulk of the product is the intellectual property and the goods.
Exactly.
If, on the other hand, the Asian firm owns both the inputs and provides this assembly service, then what the US is actually recording is the good. So we have lots of stuff going on here. We have factoryless goods production going on. We have sometimes it's a service import, sometimes it's a good import, very, very complicated. I think what might help me a little bit is if you could just give me a little bit of a numerical example of kind of how all this breaks down and what value would get, say, recorded in the US and what value might get recorded, say, in Asia or some other country that's part of this very complicated production process.
Sure, Jim. For example, if the U.S. Company sells the laptop in the U.S. for, say, $500, in the first example, when they own all the inputs except the assembly, say that they pay the contract manufacturer overseas $50. That import of a service is $50. And so when you calculate GDP, you say, $500 minus 50 is 450.
That's what gets counted in the US.
Exactly. That's the count. That's what's recorded in the US. And you can see that most of the value is in the US. But on the other example, when the contract manufacturer abroad has the raw materials, the labor, and also the factory, maybe that's more of the value. Say all that combined, that production cost is, say, $200. And then they add like a markup on it for, say, $20. So when you import that laptop, it's recorded as a good for $220. But that's not the total value of the laptop. The total value when the company sells it is $500. And so, of course, that difference between 500 less 220, that is what's recorded in US GDP.
Okay, well, I mean, that interestingly all makes sense. Like I said, it's a little bit complicated, and I can imagine as a statistician, this is one of the more challenging things that you do when you try and record all of these transactions. And I imagine it's just getting more and more complicated. So what is the statistical community doing to help people like you and other people out there who are trying to measure this accurately? What are they doing to help you guys out?
Yeah, well, we've been doing a lot. So we're recently updated the System of National Accounts, the Balance of Payments Manual, and the Industrial Classification System to try to better account for these global production arrangements.
Well, there you have it. Thanks, Jennifer, for unpacking this for us. I think this was a really complicated topic, and you really made it sound measurable. So that's it for today's episode of The Economy. How do you measure that? If you enjoyed what you heard, subscribe, like, and share. And remember, behind every economic transaction, there's a statistician like Jennifer trying to figure out how to measure it. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.